The educational materials presented here were developed by students and faculty of the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. Funding for this project was provided by grants from the American Cancer Society Midwest and the Lance Armstrong Foundation. The materials are intended for educational use and are not meant to provide medical advice. We welcome your feedback about these materials. Please use the evaluation survey link on the homepage to provide your comments and suggestions.
Sodium. To salt or not to salt? Why talk about sodium? Sodium is something that affects everyone every day. Everybody eats it, and most people are unaware that they ingest far too much and are also unaware of the health implications of a high sodium diet. Currently, the government is trying to push corporations to lower sodium in foods available to consumers. Sodium is an essential mineral, which means it is vital for the human body. Chemically, sodium is an electrolyte. Table salt is made up of both sodium and chloride. Chloride is also an important nutrient, but there is no major health concerns related to consumption of chloride. As stated earlier, sodium is an electrolyte. A normal balance of electrolytes is essential to the normal function of cells and organs. Electrolytes help maintain voltages across cell membranes, especially in heart, muscle, and nerve cells. They also carry electrical impulses to create nerve impulses and muscle contractions. Kidneys work to keep the electrolyte concentrations in blood constant. In simpler terms, sodium helps maintain balance of fluids, helps transmit nerve impulses, and influences contraction and relaxation of muscles. Many foods naturally contain sodium. The main source of sodium in processed foods plays an integral role in food processing and food safety. It enhances the flavor of foods by masking bitterness and acidity and has the ability to make sweets taste sweeter. Salt regulates the fermentation of yeast in baked goods and alcoholic beverages. It is useful in the manipulation of aroma, color, and texture of food. The most important function of salt is to preserve food and slow microbial growth, which extends the shelf life of perishable items. The 2005 Dietary Guidelines for Healthy Adults is 2,300 milligrams per day, while the populations that are high risk should only consume 1,500 milligrams. The average American consumes 3,500 milligrams daily, more than 1,000 milligrams above the recommended amount. New dietary guidelines will be issued for 2010. It is suggested that the guideline for the entire population will be 1,500 milligrams. The picture shown depicts where sodium comes from in the average diet. There is growing concern that intake of sodium is too high in the U.S. diet. This shows several examples of high sodium foods that are common in American diets. Again, the main function of sodium in food is used as a preservative and flavor enhancer. This is the reason such foods as frozen meals, canned items, and prepared mixes are high in sodium. How will you know if the food you are eating is high in sodium? Reading the nutrition facts label of products is the best way to understand this. Let's take a look at how to read this label. The food's sodium content is always shown on the food label. The amount listed will be in milligrams. This aspect of the label is important to pay attention to if you are required to be on a low sodium diet. Something to remember when reading food labels is that what is shown is only one serving size, which could make these numbers very deceiving. This particular label is for Kraft Macaroni and Cheese Deluxe Edition. Notice that there are 4 servings in this package, and only one serving consists of over a third of the dietary guideline for sodium, which is 2,300 milligrams. When looking at the percent daily value, it is important to remember that these percentages are based on a 2,000 calorie diet. The percentages are also based on totals for the whole day. For example, for this particular label, the sodium content of one serving is 35% of the total amount of sodium recommended per day. As stated before, the quantities on a food label are given in milligrams. Here are some sodium equivalents and household measures to help you compare these values. It may be surprising to find that the recommended dietary allowance for sodium is only 1 teaspoon. Specific words on food packages can be very confusing. Here are some examples of common terms used on labels related to sodium content and their explanations. It is helpful to know that these words are legally defined by the FDA, and therefore you can be sure about their meaning each time you see them on a package. Some things to note are that reduced sodium is a relative term and compares the amount of sodium in the current food to the usual product. This does not always mean the reduced sodium product is actually low in sodium. Food labeling may also be confusing when trying to meet several dietary goals. Are fat-free foods necessarily healthier when it comes to sodium content? When comparing Ritz crackers, this is not the case. Regular Ritz have a sodium content of 135 milligrams per serving, while the reduced fat Ritz have a content of 160 milligrams per serving. So the reduced fat product has more sodium than the regular product. In contrast, the low sodium Ritz product only contains 35 milligrams per serving, which is much less than either the regular or reduced fat products. Canned soups usually contain a large amount of sodium. A regular can of chicken noodle soup contains 890 milligrams per can. This is almost half of the recommended dietary allowance. A low-sodium option has considerable less sodium. However, a consumer must keep in mind that taste may be different when choosing a low-sodium option. The majority of salt used in the U.S. is mined from underground salt reserves. Obtaining salt from seawater is more expensive and labor-intensive. Sea salt refers to the grains obtained from the natural evaporation of seawater. It undergoes little or no refining technique, which allows it to retain natural traces of other minerals, including iron, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and iodine. There are slight differences in flavor and texture between sea salt and table salt, but the two contain virtually the same amount of sodium. Sea salt is sometimes advertised as being healthier than more refined salt, but in fact, there is little nutritional differences in these products. Finding a substitute for salt in foods is challenging. Potassium chloride is sometimes used in commercial products. This mimics salt by providing the salty flavor and preservation functions. However, potassium chloride has been known to possess a bitter or metallic aftertaste. Excess intake increases health issues for those with kidney or heart problems and diabetes, and it can interfere with blood pressure medications. A direct one-to-one swap is barely used, and most times the substitute is used only about half as much. Here is a sample diet with high sodium intake. The majority of the sodium comes from the processed hamburger helper meal and the deli meat. Both are high in sodium for preservation methods. Remember, the dietary guideline for sodium is 2,300 milligrams. This sample diet is 146% over that recommendation. This sample diet shows a lower sodium intake. There is less processed and ready-prepared foods. However, this diet shown does not account for salt added during preparation of such things like asparagus and rice. Notice the marinara sauce is the major source of sodium in this diet, but the total sodium intake is well below the recommended daily intake. Let's turn our attention now to the health aspects of sodium. High sodium intake has been linked to high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke. High blood pressure is also known as hypertension. The normal value for blood pressure is 120/80. I have listed values for pre-hypertension, stage 1, and stage 2 hypertension. It is important to know what your normal blood pressure is and to be aware of any increases. High blood pressure is a frightening disease because most people have no signs or symptoms. Risk factors include age, race, family history, sedentary lifestyle, high sodium intake, low potassium intake, and alcohol and tobacco use. Sodium-reduced diets may not be the answer for everyone with high blood pressure. Sodium-insensitive hypertension does exist. This means that there is a resistance of blood pressure changes with decreased sodium intake. A 2007 study in Florida tested this concept. 45 people participated in the trial for 1 year. The goal was to reduce body weight by 7% by restricting diets and implementing an exercise plan. Salt sensitivity was tested at the beginning and at the end. It was conducted to determine the blood pressure reactivity to dietary salt. Results found that salt-resistant participants did not experience lowered blood pressure after correction of obesity and related metabolic abnormalities. Much research has been done to investigate the role of dietary sodium in health. The Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, or DASH study, investigated the effects of a reduced sodium diet on blood pressure. A total of 412 participants from several U.S. cities were randomly selected to either the control or DASH diet for 30 days. The DASH diet focused on fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy food, whole grains, and lean meats, and the control diet was that of a typical American diet. The results of the study were that the subjects who consumed the DASH diet showed a reduction in blood pressure compared to those on the controlled diet. The researchers who conducted the study noted that while the results were promising, the study time was short and long-term health benefits will depend on the ability of people to make long-lasting dietary changes and the increased availability of lower sodium foods. Heart disease continues to be a major cause of death and disability worldwide. It is often caused by a buildup of fatty plaques in arteries. Risk factors include age, gender, family history, tobacco use, high blood pressure and high cholesterol levels, and prevalence of diabetes and obesity. To investigate the role of reducing dietary sodium intake on heart disease risk, a group of patients who had been diagnosed with prehypertension were followed over several years. Previously, the patients were given individual and group counseling sessions focusing specifically on sodium reduction to help them understand the sources of sodium in the diet. 10 years later, the investigators sent questionnaires to these patients to determine changes in their health. The questions focused on cardiovascular disease and self-reported sodium intake. The results of the study were that those patients who had received the sodium reduction education had a lowered cardiovascular disease risk of 25 to 30% after 10 to 15 years compared to those who had not received the education. This suggests that providing consumers who may be at risk of hypertension with education about sodium reduction early in their life may help prevent heart disease later. Stroke occurs when blood supply to the brain is interrupted or reduced. This can cause paralysis or even death. Strokes are caused by a blockage in an artery or blood vessel leak or burst. Risk factors include family history, age, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes and obesity, and tobacco and alcohol use. Although sodium is not specifically linked to stroke and heart disease, high blood pressure is. Therefore, sodium is linked to high blood pressure values. There are certain populations that are considered at risk. People with high blood pressure, kidney disease, diabetes, African Americans, and middle-aged or older adults should limit their sodium intake because they are at higher risk for developing conditions associated with high sodium intake. So what are some lifestyle changes that you could make to reduce your sodium intake? These are some examples of ways to reduce sodium intake. Choose foods, items without added salts, unsalted nuts, seeds, and beans. Limit salty snacks. Avoid adding salt and canned vegetables to homemade dishes. Unsalted and sodium fat-free broths and soups. Skim or 1% milk. Low sodium, low fat cheeses. Add spice and herbs to enhance taste. Add fresh lemon juice instead of salt to fresh vegetables. Sodium enhances the flavor of foods by masking bitterness and acidity and has the ability to make sweets taste sweeter. Salt regulates the fermentation of yeast in baked goods and alcoholic beverages. It is useful in the manipulation of aroma, color, and texture of food. The most important function of salt is to preserve food and slow microbial growth, which extends the shelf life of perishable items. The 2005 Dietary Guidelines for Healthy Adults is 2,300 milligrams per day, while the populations that are at high risk should only consume 1,500 milligrams. In order to understand if you are meeting the recommended intake levels, you should be sure to read the food labels of foods you eat. And finally, high sodium intake has been linked to high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke, so a reduced sodium diet is recommended for most everyone.